Okay, so I am going to be going through the steps to developing a central claim handout, and this is going to help you with your own central claim. But before doing that, I wanted to reread Carolyn Forche's The Kernel, discuss it just for like a minute. That way it can be fresh in your mind, and then the central claim handout will make more sense since the central claim handout is on the kernel. So here's The Kernel by Carolyn Forche. Keep in mind that this poem takes place in El Salvador in the early 80s during the Civil War there. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of the wine in the air. "Something for your poetry?" "No," he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught the scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. Okay, so now that the poem is fresh in your mind, I'm going to go through the steps developing a central claim. So here's a very basic central claim here. It's not a very good claim, but it has the basic necessary components. Carolyn Forche's The Kernel looks at torture and has a prosaic appearance, a detached tone, no line or stanza breaks, and sparse use of figurative language. I mean, it's fine, right? It has a clear focus, which is Carolyn Forche's The Kernel. It has a pretty basic central claim, which is that the poem looks at torture. And then it has a map of the main ideas of your body paragraphs. You do want to do these things in your central claim, right? You want to take a position on a poem, and then you want to map out the main ideas of your body paragraphs. But this isn't a very good central claim. So here are some steps to making it even stronger. And these are steps that you can follow in your and to help improve your central claim. The first step is to consider the relationship of your elements of analysis. That's a fancy way of saying the main ideas of your body paragraphs. And then rearrange them to show how the elements of analysis actually produce your position. In other words, you can put the map of the main ideas first, and then you could put the main claim second. So here's how it now sounds. Through its lack of line or stanza breaks, prosaic appearance, detached tone, and sparse use of figurative language, Carolyn Forche's The Kernel looks at torture. Okay, so now the claim is starting to get a little bit better by putting the map first and the actual main part of the claim second. But it's still not a great claim. And one of the things that make this not a great claim is that the verbs aren't very strong. So the second step to revising a central claim is checking the verbs and making sure that you have the most specific and active verbs possible. You always want to make sure to not have to be verbs in your central claim. To be verbs are is, are, and were, verbs like that. And also ing verbs are usually very weak. So here the claim has been revised to add a better verb. Through its lack of line or stanza breaks, prosaic appearance, detached tone, and sparse use of figurative language, Carolyn Forche's The Kernel examines torture, or explores torture, or investigates torture, or the best one, critiques torture. So adding one of these verbs already makes the central claim so much stronger and so much more debatable. So make sure that your verbs are strong in your own claim. The next step is adding a label for your poem. And that'll be the next handout I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to make a second video for that. So a label is a description of the form that your poem is written in. So a label describes both form as well as content. Carolyn Forche has described her poem as a documentary poem, right? It's a poem, it's not all fancy, it doesn't have poetic language, it doesn't have line breaks, it's not pretty. She considers her poem almost like a documentary, almost like a work of nonfiction that is meant to convey a very kind of a clear and real scenario to the reader. So I want you to add a label for your poem. So if you're writing about one of the Nye or one of the Smith poems, I want you to have a label in your central claim. And then you're going to spend one of the body paragraphs explaining why that's the label you've come up with, although you shouldn't use the word label, of course. If you're writing about the E. Cummings poems, then you can label his poems in general. So what do you see him doing stylistically in his poems? What do you see his formal and content choices to be? And so label, the style that all of his poems are in. Okay, so now let's hear the claim again, but with a label. So as you can see, the claim is getting stronger and stronger. Through its lack of line or stanza breaks, prosaic appearance, detached tone, and sparse use of figurative language, Carolyn Forche's documentary poem, The Colonel Explores Torture. You know what, I like critiques torture better. I'm gonna put critiques torture down. That's even a better verb. So see how much stronger and more debatable this claim is becoming? Okay, step 4 is to add adjective or descriptive phrases or modifying phrases that make your central claim more specific. So anywhere in your central claim where you can add descriptive phrases that will make your central claim more specific, you should do that. So here, these are the modifying phrases that were added. So take a look at how the claim now sounds. Through its lack of line or stanza breaks, prosaic appearance, detached tone, and sparse use of figurative language, Carolyn Forche's documentary poem, The Colonel, explores the traditionally unpoetic topic of torture in a fairly unpoetic way. So these descriptive phrases make the claim even more specific and even more debatable. So we know it explores torture, or critiques torture, but here, now we know why that's significant, right? When we think of poetry, we usually think of, poems as being love poems, or maybe even political poems. We don't usually think of them as being about torture. Okay, step 5 is to consider a larger context or contrast. What that means is to consider the larger social, political, or historical context for the poem, or even the aesthetic context, or to acknowledge an opposing viewpoint. So an although clause. So acknowledge how someone may disagree with your position, or how someone may make an argument against your position in your central claim. So what was done here was adding the context for the claim. So historically, poetry is focused on topics that are considered eternal or universal, right? Topics that apply to everybody, such as death, love, and existence. However, 20th century poets, including Forche, have challenged the traditional topics for poetry. So this, to say this, you would have to know something, a little bit about poetry. Okay, through its lack of line or stanza breaks, prosaic appearance, detached tone, and sparse use of figurative language, Carolyn Forche's documentary poem, The Colonel, explores the traditionally unpoetic topic of torture in a fairly unpoetic way. So you see how the claim is getting more and more detailed. We have the context, right? And the context doesn't have to be a poetic context. It can be what's happening in our society today, what our concerns are today with racism or stereotypes or presidential elections. And then you have a map of the main ideas of the body paragraphs, and then you have a label for the poem then you have the poem itself, and then you have the central claim on the poem, which is being fully described with adjectives and modifiers. So now there's actually one more step. And the last step is to make sure that you are clearly saying how the stylistic choices that the poet is making, another way to say it is the formal choices, mirrors the meaning of the poem or conveys the meaning of the poem. So here's how the final draft of the claim looks. Historically, poetry is focused on topics that are considered eternal or universal, such as death, love, and existence. However, many 20th century poets, including Forche, have challenged the traditional topics for poetry. Carolyn Forche's poem of Witness, this should be documentary poem, little typo there. Documentary poem, The Colonel, explores the traditionally unpoetic topic of torture in a fairly unpoetic way. Through its lack of line or stanza breaks, prosaic appearance, detached tone, and sparse use of figurative language, the Colonel enacts the brutality and banality of political repression through the brutality and banality of its form. So we all know what brutality means. Banality means being everyday, being commonplace. So in El Salvador, if a bunch of people are walking around without ears, that means that that there's a lot of political repression happening there. That's very brutal. If a colonel is keeping ears, it also must be pretty common because it's happening right here in public. The colonel feels very comfortable doing this, spilling these ears in the middle of a dinner party. And the form itself is very brutal and very banal because the writing style is so simple and plain. It looks like prose. It doesn't look fancy. It doesn't even look like a poem, which mirrors the meaning. Okay, so I want you to follow all of these steps when you're revising your central claim. Make sure that you have a map of the main ideas of your body paragraphs. Make sure you have a label for your poems. Make sure you describe the writing style that your poems are written in, that you are analyzing. Make sure you have a central claim, which states your interpretation of the poem. If you're writing about E. Cummings, you can still do this. You can still come up with a label for the kind of poems he wrote. You can still come up with a position, which is what kinds of laws he would pass. And you can still describe how form conveys content in his poems. Okay, I'm going to be now creating a second video that talks about labels. In fact, I may be able to squeeze it in this video. So hold on a minute. Let me go get the other handout up. So you can study this handout on your own. This is already on Canvas, but just to briefly show you this handout, you can label your poem a type. And then you can spend on your body paragraphs explaining why it is that type. So the type can be something really straightforward, like it's a narrative poem, or it's a prose poem, or it's a political poem, or a personal poem, right? Or a letter poem. Or it can be something more creative, something that describes both the form and content. For example, you could describe E. Cummings next to, of course, God America as a highly ironic anti-war sonnet that praises the deaths of young soldiers. So it's a sonnet, which is its form, which is a typical form, but then there's a description of the kind of sonnet, right? It's an ironic anti-war sonnet that praises, so it's not really praising, that's why praises is in quotation marks, the deaths of young soldiers. So you can have something more simple like this or something more specific like this, which is a combination of a invented form or type and a more creative one. So there's a ton of examples here. There's other examples here of invented forms that you can look at, examples of how students have invented forms for their poems. And what I thought was really fun is I've been watching the new Beyonce or B video formation. I think it's a great video. And I've been reading essays about it. A ton of scholars have already written essays about it. And in their essays, they come up with labels for the poem. They don't call it that or for the video, but that's exactly what they're doing. So here's an example of one label. Formation is a Texas-style fatback and biscuits with country gravy, a dizzying spell that pulls from multiple places and modes of Black Southern experience. Here's another label. Formation is a Black anthem for Black women. It's a rallying cry sent from Queen Bee to the masses. Here's one that's a little bit more academic. Formation is a metaphor, a Black feminist, Black queer feminist theory of community organizing and resistance, right? And then it goes on to say, formation is the alignment, the stillness, the readying, the quiet before the twerk, the turn up, the social movements. This one's a little more difficult, I realize. But come up with a label for your poem or for your groups of poems if you're doing E. Cummings in your central claim. Okay, thanks so much. I look forward to reading your final drafts. Bye-bye.